there are people who leave traces everywhere they go. Sally and John was one of them. Not the kind of traces the police would later search for, fibers, fingerprints, the microscopic evidence of presence. No. Sally left herself in conversations that people remembered years later. In jokes that still made her friends smile when they thought of her. In the way she could walk into the Crown pub on a Tuesday night and somehow make the whole room feel like someone had turned up the volume on life itself. Her mother, Leslie, would say it this way: she was bright and beautiful and could make anyone smile. But that's what mothers say, isn't it? That's the language of love, of memory softened by absence. What made it true, what made Sally Sally, was harder to put into words. It was in the way she moved through Swindon like she belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. 23 years old in the summer of 1995, and already she'd lived more lives than seemed possible for someone so young. She'd grown up here, in this post-industrial town in Wiltshire where the railway works had once employed thousands and now employed ghosts. Swindon in the mid-90s was a place trying to figure out what it was becoming. The old certainties, manufacturing, apprenticeships, jobs for life, had evaporated. In their place, call centers, retail parks, a shopping center that tried too hard to convince you things were looking up. Sally had watched her town change. Or maybe she'd changed with it. Either way, by 1995 she was living in a flat on Kimmeridge Close in Neath, a quiet residential area, and working the streets between Swindon's bus station and train station when she needed money. This is where the story gets complicated. Where people start making assumptions. Sex worker. Prostitute. The labels that flatten a person into a category, that make it easier to look away. But Sally wasn't a label. She was someone's daughter. Someone's friend. She was the girl who'd started getting into trouble in her late teens, who'd fallen in with what her mother called the wrong people, who'd found herself in a life she'd been planning to leave behind. Planning. That's the word her mother used. Shortly before she disappeared, she'd planned to try and get away from the life of sex work. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. There's a photograph that police would later circulate. Sally smiling, dark hair framing her face, eyes that seemed to hold some private amusement at the camera itself. Looking at that photo, you wouldn't know she was struggling. You wouldn't know about the wrong people, the bad choices, the nights she'd spend working corners she knew too well. You'd just see someone young and alive and completely unaware that she was about to become a question mark. The thing about disappearances is they have to start somewhere. Some moment when the person is still definitively there, still solid and real and occupying space in the world. For Sally and John, that moment was 10:50 p.m. on Friday, September 8, 1995. Alexandra Street. The junction with Aylesbury Street and Station Road. This was her territory. The area around Swindon's transport hubs where sex workers congregated, where cars would slow down, where transactions were negotiated in hushed tones through partially rolled-down windows. It was raining that night. Not hard enough to drive people inside, but enough to make the streets shine under the streetlights, enough to make anyone standing outside look slightly desperate. Sally was there. Multiple witnesses would later confirm it. She was wearing. Actually, we don't know what she was wearing. That detail got lost somewhere in the original investigation, in the gap between seeing someone and really noticing them. But she was there. That much is certain. And then she wasn't. No scream. No struggle witnessed by passing cars. No one saw her get into a vehicle, though in that area, at that time of night, seeing a sex worker get into a car wouldn't have registered as unusual. It was the entire point of being there. But Sally didn't come home that night. Or the next day. Or ever. Her flat on Kimmeridge Close sat waiting for her. The police would check it when her family reported her missing. They'd find everything still inside. Clothes in the wardrobe. Money, not much, but some, still in the flat. Her identification. All the things a person takes when they're planning to leave for good. Her father would tell investigators, if Sally left, she would have taken something. It was such a simple observation, but it contained multitudes. It said, I know my daughter. I know how she thinks, how she moves through the world. And this leaving everything behind, this isn't her. But what choice did the police have? This was 1995. A sex worker had gone missing. There was no body. No evidence of foul play. No witnesses to an abduction. Just absence. They opened a missing person case. The initial investigation was thorough, or as thorough as these things were in the mid-90s. They interviewed Sally's friends, the other women working the same streets. They visited pubs and nightclubs. They put out appeals in other towns where Sally had worked: Reading, Bournemouth, Bristol, Birmingham. A woman matching Sally's description had reportedly been seen at Swindon railway station early on the morning of September 9th, looking at train timetables. Maybe she'd left. Maybe she'd finally done what she'd been planning, gotten away from it all, started fresh somewhere else. Except for what her father said about taking nothing with her. Except for the fact that her friend said she was the type to stay in touch, to let people know she was okay. Except for the simple, gnawing reality that people don't usually vanish into thin air unless someone makes them vanish. But without evidence, what could the police do? The investigation ran until December 1995, 3 months of searching that led nowhere. And then, like so many missing person cases involving vulnerable women, it began to fade from public attention. Sally's family didn't forget. How could they? Every birthday that came and went. Every Christmas. Every time the phone rang and for just a second, just a heartbeat, they'd think, maybe it's her. Leslie, Sally's mother, would speak to reporters in 1998, 4 years after her daughter's disappearance. We think about her every day. A lot has happened since she has been away. Since she has been away. The grammar of hope. The refusal to say, since she died or, since she was killed. Just, away. As if Sally had stepped out and would someday step back in. The years accumulated. 1996, 1997. 2000, the millennium turned and Sally and John was still missing. Still a question without an answer. Swindon changed around her absence. The town centre got a makeover. New developments sprouted in places that had been wasteland. Life moved on, the way it always does, flowing around the gaps left by missing people like water around stones. But Sally's case didn't close. It couldn't close. Because disappearing isn't illegal. You can't prosecute someone for vanishing. And without a body, without evidence of homicide, there was no murder investigation. Just a file in a cabinet somewhere. Just a mother who thought about her daughter every day. Just a question, where is Sally and John? The thing about cold cases is they're not really cold. They're just waiting. Waiting for technology to advance. Waiting for someone's conscience to break. Waiting for the right person to look at the file with fresh eyes and see something everyone else had missed. For Sally's case, that wait would last nearly 2 decades. Let me tell you what it's like when someone you love goes missing. It's not like death. Death has ceremonies. Death has closure. Death has a body to bury, a grave to visit, a shape to your grief. Missing is different. Missing is limbo. Missing is checking your voicemail too many times, just in case. Missing is seeing someone who looks like them on the street and your heart stops before your brain catches up and reminds you, no. It can't be. It's been too long. For Sally's family and friends, the 1990s and early 2000s were years spent in this limbo. Not quite mourning, because how can you mourn someone who might still be alive? But not quite hoping either, because as the years pile up, hope starts to feel like delusion. They'd think about her in London, like the woman at the train station had suggested. Maybe she'd made it out, found some kind of life in the anonymity of the capital. Maybe she was working in a shop, or a restaurant, or doing any of 1,000 things people do to get by. Maybe she'd changed her name. Maybe she had reasons they couldn't understand but had to respect, for not coming home. Or maybe the worst had happened that night on Alexandra Street. Maybe someone had hurt her. Maybe she hadn't gotten into that car voluntarily. Maybe all her plans to get away from sex work, all her hopes for something different, had ended in violence on a rainy September night. But without knowing, they were stuck. Suspended between 2 unbearable possibilities. Leslie gave interviews when she could. When reporters still cared. When Sally's disappearance briefly resurfaced in the news. She'd plead for information. Someone out there knows what happened to Sally. It is horrible to think that she might have been hurt or alone. We really want to know what happened to Sally, and someone in Swindon has this information, so I am pleading with you to go to the police. The pleading of a mother to strangers. Please. If you know something. Anything. But Swindon in the 1990s, Swindon in the early 2000s, wasn't particularly interested in the fate of a missing sex worker. That's the ugly truth of it. When women in vulnerable positions disappear, the urgency is different. The public concern is muted. The resources allocated are less. It's not written down anywhere. It's not official policy. But it's real nonetheless. Sally and John disappeared in 1995 and the world, for the most part, shrugged. And then, 2013. 18 years after Sally vanished, Wiltshire Police decided to review her case. Cold case reviews are becoming more common. Advances in forensic technology mean evidence that was useless in 1995 might be revelatory in 2013. DNA analysis, digital databases, geographic profiling, the tools of modern policing can shed light on old mysteries. But sometimes it's not about technology. Sometimes it's about someone finally asking the right questions. In 2013, investigators began conducting extensive checks to establish whether Sally and John was still alive. They searched databases, checked for any trace of her using government services, looked for bank activity, any digital footprint that might indicate she'd been living under the radar all these years. They found nothing. Let that sink in for a moment. In the modern world, it's almost impossible to be completely invisible. Unless you're living entirely off the grid, no doctor's visits, no benefit claims, no utility bills in your name, you leave traces. And Sally had left none. Which meant one of two things: either she'd spent 18 years being extraordinarily careful to avoid all official contact, or she'd been dead since shortly after September 8, 1995. The police began to lean toward the latter. On November 17, 2014, Wiltshire Police made an announcement that would change everything. They were upgrading Sally's case from a missing person inquiry to a murder investigation. After 19 years, they were officially treating her disappearance as homicide. Detective Inspector Tim Corner stood before cameras and explained, this reinvestigation was initiated following a review of the original investigation and significant new lines of inquiry were established. This has been reclassified as a murder investigation as detectives believe it is likely that Sally was murdered following her disappearance in 1995. Significant new lines of inquiry. What did that mean? What had they found? The police weren't saying. Not yet. But for Sally's family, the announcement was double-edged. Relief that someone was finally taking this seriously. Horror at the confirmation of what they'd probably known in their hearts for years. Sally was gone. Someone had taken her. Leslie spoke to reporters again, her voice breaking. Sally disappeared 19 years ago and I still think of her every day. For years I have wondered where she could be and I have had to deal with the thought that she might have been killed. For a long time I and all of Sally's family and friends have not known what happened to her, where she is or if she was even alive. That uncertainty, the not knowing, it's its own kind of torture. At least now there was acknowledgement. At least now there were resources being directed toward finding out what really happened. But murder investigations need evidence. They need suspects. They need something more than an absence. And that's when the police made a decision that would become central to the entire case. They were going to search Sally's last known address, the flat on Kimmeridge Close in Neath where she'd lived in 1995. The search took place in March 2015, nearly 20 years after Sally disappeared. Think about that. 20 years. The flat had long since been occupied by other tenants. Families had moved in and out. Carpets had been replaced. Walls repainted. The place had been lived in by people who had no connection to Sally and John, who probably didn't even know a missing woman had once called it home. But forensic archaeology doesn't care about time. Blood soaks into floorboards. DNA embeds itself in surfaces. If something violent had happened in that flat, traces might still remain. The police brought in cadaver dogs, specially trained animals that can detect the scent of human decomposition even decades after the fact. They brought ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the floors and foundations. They worked methodically, section by section, looking for anything that might tell them what had happened to Sally. Neighbors watched the police tape go up, the officers in white suits going in and out. They asked each other, "Did you know someone was murdered here?" Even though nobody knew for certain yet. That's what police searches mean in people's minds. Confirmation of the worst. The search took days. The police were thorough. They had to be. This was their chance to find physical evidence in a case that had been all questions and no answers for 2 decades. And when they were done, nothing. No body. No blood evidence that could definitively link to Sally. No hidden grave beneath the floorboards. The flat gave up no secrets. But the investigation wasn't over. Because while the forensic search was happening, detectives were pursuing other leads. Other possibilities. Other suspects. On September 25, 2015, just over 6 months after the search of Sally's flat, police made arrests. 3 men, all in their 50s, were taken into custody on suspicion of kidnap and murder. The news hit Swindon like a thunderclap. After 20 years, were they finally about to get answers? Had the police found Sally's killer? The arrests happened simultaneously in the early morning. Coordinated raids, multiple locations. This wasn't a fishing expedition. The police had something. Some evidence. Some reason to believe these 3 men were involved. For Sally's family, the wait must have been excruciating. 3 men in custody. Interviews happening behind closed doors. The possibility, the terrifying, hopeful possibility, that someone might finally tell them what happened to their daughter, their friend, their Sally. But then, release. One by one, the 3 men were released without charge. The police statement was brief, professional, deliberately vague. 3 men arrested on suspicion of kidnap and murder have been released pending further inquiries. Pending further inquiries. That careful language that means, we don't have enough. Not yet. The public never learned who these men were. Their names were never released. Their connection to Sally, if there was one, remained unknown. Were they people she knew? Clients? Friends? Complete strangers who'd somehow come under suspicion? The silence from investigators was absolute. And for Sally's family, for anyone who'd allowed themselves to hope, the disappointment was crushing. They'd been so close. Or had they? Maybe the arrests were based on thin evidence. Maybe the police had been desperate for a breakthrough and moved too soon. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that haunts cold cases, maybe they had the right people but couldn't prove it. You can know in your gut who did something. You can have suspicions that border on certainty. But the law doesn't run on gut feelings. It runs on evidence. And without enough evidence to charge, let alone convict, all you can do is release suspects back into the world and hope that someday, somehow, something will break. But here's the thing about the 2015 arrests, they proved the police were actively investigating. They had leads. They had suspects. They were building something, even if it hadn't yet resulted in charges. The case wasn't cold. It was active. It was burning. And then, in March 2017, the police revealed something that would become the most haunting detail of the entire investigation. The postcard. Imagine receiving mail from someone who's supposed to be missing. Not an email or a text, those can be faked easily, sent from anywhere. But a physical postcard. Something that had to be written by hand, purchased from a shop, dropped in a postbox, processed through the postal system. Something tangible. That's what happened to a man named Clive. The police never released Clive's last name. They described him only as a friend of Sally's. But sometime after Sally's disappearance, the exact date was never made public, Clive received a postcard purportedly from her. The message was brief. Casual. The kind of thing you might write to a friend when you're away and thinking of them. Hi Clive, just to let you know I am all right. I have moved away from Swindon and moved to London. I am all right, so stop worrying about me. I'm okay, big boy. Love, Sally Ann. Followed by multiple kisses. Read that again. Read it slowly. I'm all right, so stop worrying about me. Why would Sally assume Clive was worrying? Because she'd left without telling anyone. Because she knew her disappearance would cause concern. I'm okay, big boy. That intimate nickname. The playfulness of it. The kisses at the end. This was a postcard written by someone who knew Clive well. Someone comfortable with affection, with pet names, with reassuring him specifically that she was fine. For years, maybe the entire time Sally had been missing, Clive had this postcard. This piece of evidence that maybe she had just left. Maybe she was in London, living her life, wanting to be left alone. Maybe Clive had shown it to other friends. Maybe it had eased their worries. Sally's okay. She sent Clive a postcard. She's in London. But when the murder investigation was launched, when police began digging deeper into every aspect of Sally's disappearance, Clive did the right thing. He came forward. He showed them the postcard. And the police sent it for forensic analysis. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the investigation. The handwriting wasn't Sally's. According to investigators who'd analyzed the postcard against known samples of Sally's writing, she hadn't written it. Someone else had. Someone had forged a postcard from Sally, made it look like she'd left voluntarily, and sent it to Clive. Detective Inspector Jim Taylor told reporters in March 2017, an extensive handwriting analysis has been conducted and it is believed that this postcard was not written by Sally. This is significant as it shows someone was trying to make people believe Sally had gone to London and was still alive. Let me repeat that, someone was trying to make people believe Sally had gone to London and was still alive. Why? Why would someone do that? The answer is obvious and terrible: to buy time. To reduce the urgency of the search. To make Sally's family and friends think she was safe somewhere when she was already gone. But here's where the postcard mystery gets even stranger. According to the police, the postcard may have been sent before Sally's disappearance was reported. Think about the timeline. Sally vanished on September 8, 1995. If the postcard arrived shortly after that, within days or a week, it would have been sent either very quickly after her disappearance, or possibly even before. Which raises the most disturbing question of all: did someone plan Sally's murder in advance? Had they already decided she was going to disappear, already prepared a way to explain her absence, already written and ready to mail this forgery to make it seem like she'd left of her own accord? The premeditation that would require. The cold calculation. The intimate knowledge not just of Sally, but of the people around her. Of Clive specifically. Who was Clive? The police have never elaborated beyond calling him Sally's friend. But the postcard suggests something more than casual acquaintance. I'm okay, big boy. That's not how you address someone you barely know. That's intimate language. Familiar. Comfortable. So who was Clive to Sally? A boyfriend. The way the postcard is written, the reassurance, the affection, the kisses, it reads like something written to a romantic partner. A client. Sally worked as a sex worker. Some clients become regulars. Some relationships blur the line between transaction and genuine connection. A close friend. Someone Sally trusted enough to confide in, to let her guard down with. We don't know. The police haven't said. Maybe they don't want to identify Clive publicly because he's not a suspect, just a witness, someone who deserves privacy in the midst of tragedy. Or maybe Clive is part of the investigation in ways we don't understand yet. Here's what we do know: whoever wrote that postcard knew about Clive. Knew he was someone Sally would write to. Knew he'd be worried about her. Knew him well enough to forge a message that would sound plausible. Which means the person who killed Sally, and let's be clear, the police are treating this as murder, wasn't a random stranger. This wasn't an opportunistic crime committed by someone who didn't know her. This was someone in Sally's orbit. Someone who understood her life, her relationships, her routines. Someone close enough to know about Clive. The postcard revelation in March 2017 brought new attention to Sally's case. The BBC ran the story. Local newspapers covered it extensively. Crime shows discussed it. People who'd never heard of Sally and John before were suddenly asking questions. Who would do this? Who would kill a young woman and then forge a postcard to cover their tracks? The police put out a fresh appeal for information. They released details about Sally's movements in the days before she disappeared. They asked anyone who'd seen her, spoken to her, had any contact with her in September 1995 to come forward. They offered a reward, £10,000 for information leading to a conviction. Detective Inspector Jim Taylor made it clear this was now a priority case. Sally was just 23 when she was murdered. For the last 22 years, her family have not known what happened to her or where she is. They deserve answers, and I am determined to find out what happened to Sally and bring her killer to justice. The language had shifted. Not, if she was murdered, anymore. Just, when she was murdered. The police knew. They'd known since upgrading the case to homicide in 2014, but now they were saying it publicly, unequivocally. Sally and John was dead. Someone had killed her. And that someone had tried to hide it with a forged postcard. But knowing something and proving it are different things entirely. The case remained unsolved. There's a particular kind of haunting that comes with unsolved murders. It's not the haunting of ghosts or supernatural things. It's the haunting of questions that have no answers. Of a person-shaped hole in the world that never gets filled in. For Sally's mother Leslie, now in her 70s, the years since 1995 have been defined by this absence. Every year that passes is another year without knowing. Another birthday Sally never reaches. Another Christmas with an empty chair. In interviews, Leslie has spoken about the toll of not knowing. I still want closure. I still want to know what happened. Every day I wake up and I think about Sally. Every day I go to bed thinking about her. That never stops. That never stops. The relentlessness of loving someone who's gone but not buried. Who's missing but not found. Sally's friends, the ones who knew her in those final months, who worked the same streets, who shared the same struggles, they've carried their own grief. Some have died in the years since. Drug overdoses. Violence. The precarious existence that comes with life on the margins. Others have gotten out, built different lives, but still carry Sally with them. Still remember her smile. Still wonder what might have been different if she'd disappeared a year later, or if she'd managed to leave sex work just a few weeks earlier, before whatever happened that night on Alexandra Street. The community of sex workers in Swindon, decimated over the years by drugs and violence and time, has long memories. They know the names of the women who've disappeared. Who've been found dead. Who've been murdered and their killers never caught. Sally is part of that terrible litany. But her case is different because of the postcard. Because someone cared enough to try to hide what they'd done. Because this wasn't just murder, it was murder followed by deception. And that deception suggests something crucial. The killer knew that people would look for Sally. Knew that questions would be asked. Cared enough about being caught to create a false trail. That level of concern suggests someone with something to lose. Someone who couldn't afford to be connected to her disappearance. Someone who thought they could get away with it. Which brings us to the question everyone asks when they hear Sally's story: what about Christopher Halliwell? If you know anything about missing women in Swindon, you know that name. Christopher Halliwell. Taxi driver. Serial killer. The men who murdered at least 2 women in the area, Sian O'Callaghan in 2011 and Becky Godden, whose body wasn't found until 2011 but who'd been killed between 2003 and 2005. When Halliwell was arrested, when police began excavating his history, when they realized he'd been driving a taxi around Swindon for years with access to vulnerable women, everyone started asking the same question. How many others? Halliwell was cryptic when questioned. He told Detective Superintendent Steve Wiltshire, "Do you want me to tell you about them all? Have a look at the list." What list? How many? The police suspected, and still suspect, that Halliwell killed more women than just Becky and Sian. The question is, who? And every time that question is asked, Sally and John's name comes up. The timeline works. Halliwell was in Swindon in 1995. He was driving taxis, which meant he'd have been in the exact area where Sally worked. The bus station. The train station. The streets where women got into cars with strangers. The victimology works. Halliwell targeted vulnerable women. Women involved in sex work. Women who might not be immediately missed or whose disappearances might not be immediately investigated with full resources. Sally fit the profile exactly. But, and this is important, the police have never confirmed any link between Halliwell and Sally's disappearance. In fact, they've been careful to keep the two cases separate in public statements. They've never named Halliwell as a suspect in Sally's murder. They've never said they've found evidence connecting him to her. Which could mean several things. It could mean they've investigated the connection and ruled him out. Maybe Halliwell has an alibi for the night Sally disappeared. Maybe his method of killing, the way he murdered Becky and Sion, doesn't match what investigators believe happened to Sally. Or it could mean they suspect him but can't prove it. Halliwell is already serving a life sentence. He's never getting out. Without new evidence, there's no point in publicly naming him as a suspect in cases they can't prosecute. Or, and this is the possibility that should give us pause, it could mean Sally's killer is someone else entirely. Someone still out there. Someone who's watched the investigation focus on Halliwell and felt relief that attention has drifted away from them. Let's talk about what we actually know versus what we suspect. What we know, Sally and John was last seen alive around 10:50 p.m. on September 8, 1995, in the area of Alexandra Street and Aylesbury Street in Swindon. She never returned to her flat. All her belongings remained there. Her family reported her missing. The initial investigation treated it as a missing person case. For nearly 20 years, the case went cold. What we know, in 2013, a cold case review began. In 2014, the case was reclassified as murder. In 2015, Sally's former flat was forensically searched. 3 men were arrested and released without charge. In 2017, police revealed that a postcard supposedly from Sally had been forged. What we know, the case remains unsolved. No one has been charged. Sally's body has never been found. That's it. That's the sum total of confirmed facts available to the public. Everything else, all the theories, all the speculation about who might have killed her and why, exists in the realm of possibility rather than certainty. But possibilities matter. Because somewhere in the space between what we know and what we suspect, the truth is hiding. Think about the geography of that night. Central Swindon in 1995 wasn't a large area. The bus station, the train station, the streets where Sally worked, you could walk from one end to the other in 15 minutes. It was a concentrated zone of commerce and transit, busy during the day, quieter at night, but never truly empty. The area attracted sex workers precisely because of the transport links. Men traveling through. Businessmen catching late trains. Truck drivers. Strangers who wanted anonymity and could disappear back into their own lives after a transaction. But it also attracted locals. Men from Swindon who knew these streets, who knew which corners the women worked, who were familiar faces rather than one-time encounters. When Sally disappeared that night, someone either took her away from that area or convinced her to leave with them willingly. Either scenario requires consideration. If she was taken by force, grabbed, overpowered, forced into a vehicle, it happened without witnesses. Or at least, without witnesses who came forward. In a public area at 10:50 p.m. on a Friday night, that's not impossible, but it's difficult. It requires speed, confidence, and a degree of planning. If she went willingly, got into a car with someone she knew, or someone who seemed safe, or simply a client, that's easier to imagine. Sex workers got into cars with men all the time. It was the nature of the work. And if Sally thought this was just another transaction, she'd have had no reason to resist. But here's the crucial detail, she never came back. Which means either the transaction went catastrophically wrong, or the person she got in the car with never intended to let her go. The forged postcard changes everything about how we understand this case. Before the postcard revelation, you could construct a narrative where Sally's murder was unplanned. A violent client. A situation that escalated. Panic, then disposal of the body, then silence. But the postcard proves premeditation. Or at least, it proves someone took deliberate steps after Sally's death to create a false trail. Think about what that requires. First, knowledge of Sally's handwriting well enough to attempt to forge it. Or at least, confidence that a forged note wouldn't be immediately recognized as fake. Second, knowledge of Clive, who he was, what he meant to Sally, that he'd be someone worth sending this message to. Third, access to a postcard and a mailbox, and the composure to actually write and send this thing while presumably dealing with the aftermath of murder. Fourth, the psychological capacity to do all this. To kill someone and then sit down and write a chatty, affectionate message pretending to be them. That's not the profile of a panicked killer trying to cover their tracks in the moment. That's someone who could compartmentalize. Someone who could plan. Someone organized. So who fits that description? Let's consider the possibilities methodically. Possibility 1, a stranger. A random predator who happened to encounter Sally that night. Someone driving through Swindon, perhaps. Someone who saw an opportunity and took it. The problem with this theory, the postcard. How would a stranger know about Clive? How would they know to send a message specifically designed to ease concerns about Sally's disappearance? Unless the stranger spent time with Sally before killing her. Unless she told him about her life, about Clive, about wanting to leave Swindon. Unless the killer extracted that information and then used it. It's possible. But it requires a particular kind of predator. Organized. Patient. Someone who could gain Sally's trust before betraying it. Possibility 2, a client. Someone who'd paid for Sally's services before. Maybe a regular. Someone who knew her routine, knew where she worked, knew she was trying to get out of sex work. This fits better. A regular client could know about Clive, could have heard Sally mention him. Could know enough about her life to forge a plausible message. But why kill her? What would trigger that escalation? Maybe Sally refused something. Maybe the client wanted more than she was willing to give. Maybe there was an argument about money, or boundaries, or the simple fact that Sally wanted out and this client couldn't accept that. Or maybe this was someone who'd been planning it for a while. Someone who developed an obsession. Someone who decided if he couldn't have Sally on his terms, no one would. Possibility 3, someone in Sally's personal life. A boyfriend. An ex. A friend. Someone with intimate knowledge of her relationships and movements. The postcard makes the most sense in this scenario. Someone close enough to know about Clive. Close enough to know Sally's handwriting, or to attempt to forge it. Close enough to understand that a message from Sally saying she'd moved to London would be believable. But who? The police have never publicly identified any suspects from Sally's personal circle. If there was an obvious candidate, an abusive ex, a jealous partner, surely that would have come out in 20+ years of investigation. Unless the person was one of the 3 men arrested in 2015. Unless the police know exactly who did it but can't prove it. Possibility 4, Christopher Halliwell. The serial killer theory. The idea that Sally was one of multiple victims, that her disappearance fits the pattern of a predator who operated in Swindon for years. This theory has appeal because it offers a neat answer. One killer, multiple victims, a closed case once you identify him. But the postcard doesn't fit Halliwell's known pattern. He didn't send fake messages from his victims. He didn't try to make it look like they'd left voluntarily. He buried them and stayed silent. Could he have evolved? Could his method in 1995 have been different from his method in 2003 or 2011? Maybe. Serial killers do sometimes refine their approach over time. But it's speculation without evidence. Here's what frustrates everyone who follows this case: we're missing crucial information. We don't know what the significant new lines of inquiry were that led to the case being reclassified as murder in 2014. The police haven't said. We don't know what evidence led to the 3 arrests in 2015. We don't know who those men were or how they were connected to Sally. We don't know the full forensic analysis of the postcard. Was it just the handwriting that was wrong, or were there other clues? Fingerprints. DNA. The type of paper or ink. We don't know if the police have suspects they're building a case against, or if they're genuinely starting from scratch after 27 years. All we have are fragments. Pieces of a puzzle that don't quite fit together yet. But sometimes, in cases like this, the absence of information tells its own story. Let me take you back to September 1995 for a moment. Not to the night Sally disappeared, but to the days after. To the period when people who knew her started to realize she was missing. Her friends would have noticed first. The other women working the same streets. Have you seen Sally? No. When was the last time? Friday night. Yeah, me too. The informal network of sex workers, women who looked out for each other because often no one else would have started asking questions. Checking usual haunts. The Crown Pub. Other spots where Sally was known. Nothing. Then her family. A day without contact might not be unusual. 2 days, starting to worry. 3 days, panic setting in. The missing person report filed. Police asking questions, when did you last see her? Was she with anyone? Did she mention going anywhere? And then, maybe a week later, maybe 2, the postcard arrives. Clive opens his mail and there it is. Sally's handwriting. Or what looks like it. Hi Clive, just to let you know I am all right. I have moved away from Swindon and moved to London. The relief must have been overwhelming. She's okay. She left. She's starting over, just like she'd been planning. Clive tells people. Sally sent me a postcard. She's in London. She's fine. The word spreads. The worry eases. The police noted in their file, subject reportedly sent communication indicating voluntary departure. And just like that, the urgency drains out of the investigation. That's what the killer was counting on. But here's what I keep coming back to, why Clive? Not Sally's mother. Not her father. Not a best friend or sibling. Clive. What did that choice reveal? Option 1, Clive was the person Sally was closest to. The one she'd most likely write to. The one whose concern would be most pressing. Option 2, Clive was the person the killer most needed to convince. Maybe because Clive was asking too many questions. Maybe because Clive knew something, or might figure something out, that could lead back to the killer. Option 3, sending the postcard to Clive served a specific purpose we don't understand yet. Maybe it deflected suspicion away from someone. Maybe it reinforced a particular narrative. The police have never indicated whether Clive is considered a suspect. The fact that he came forward with the postcard when the murder investigation was launched suggests cooperation. Suggests someone trying to help, not hide. But we don't know. We don't know if detectives looked at Clive closely. We don't know if he had an alibi for the night Sally disappeared. We don't know what his relationship with Sally actually was beyond the vague description of a friend. And maybe that's deliberate. Maybe the police are keeping Clive's identity and relationship to Sally private because the investigation is still active and they don't want to compromise it. Or maybe Clive is just another person destroyed by this. Another person who loved Sally or cared about her, who's had to live with her absence for nearly 3 decades, who's had to wonder if there was something he could have done differently. There's a photograph that appeared in some of the news coverage. Not of Sally, we've seen that one already, her smiling face, her dark hair, her life frozen at 23. This is a photograph of the street where she was last seen. Alexandra Street in modern-day Swindon. The bus station visible in the background. The shops and buildings that would have been there in 1995, mostly still standing. It's an ordinary street. That's what strikes you. Nothing sinister about it. Just a normal British high street in a medium-sized town. But on that street, on a Friday night in September 1995, something terrible happened. Sally and John stepped into a car, or an alley, or someone's orbit, and never stepped back out. And someone who might still walk those same streets, who might still live in Swindon, who might still think about what they did on quiet nights, someone knows exactly what happened. The psychological profile of Sally's killer, based on what we know, would include several elements. Local knowledge. The person knew Swindon. Knew the area where Sally worked. Knew the patterns of the streets, the timing of when police patrols would pass, where cameras were and weren't. Connection to Sally. Either directly or indirectly, the killer knew enough about her life to forge the postcard. This wasn't a completely random stranger. Capacity for deception. The postcard represents a calculated attempt to mislead. This person could lie convincingly, could maintain that lie for years. Ability to hide a body. Sally has never been found. That means the killer either had access to a location where remains could be hidden effectively, or knowledge of how to dispose of a body in a way that prevents discovery. Emotional detachment or compartmentalization. To kill someone and then write a cheerful postcard pretending to be them requires a particular psychological makeup. Either someone with no empathy, or someone capable of separating their actions from their emotions. Does that profile point to one specific person? No. It could describe dozens of people. But it narrows the field. It tells us something about who we're looking for. In March 2017, when the police revealed the forged postcard, they made another appeal. Detective Inspector Jim Taylor stood before cameras and spoke directly to whoever killed Sally. Someone out there has vital information about Sally's murder. I would urge anyone with information, no matter how insignificant you think it might be, to come forward. You may hold the key to solving this case and finally giving Sally's family the answers they desperately need. That phrase, no matter how insignificant you think it might be, is crucial. Because sometimes in cold cases, the breakthrough doesn't come from dramatic new evidence. It comes from someone remembering a small detail. A strange comment someone made. A person who acted oddly around the time of the disappearance. A vehicle seen in an unusual place. Memory is unreliable, especially over decades. But sometimes fragments persist. And sometimes those fragments, when placed in context with other information, create a picture. The police were hoping someone in Swindon had such a fragment. Had seen something, heard something, suspected something back in 1995 and never reported it. Maybe because they didn't think it mattered. Maybe because they were afraid. Maybe because they were protecting someone. But the appeal was also a message to the killer: we haven't forgotten. We're still looking. And we will find you. There's a concept in criminal psychology called the golden hour, the initial period after a crime when evidence is fresh, witnesses' memories are clear, and the chances of solving the case are highest. For Sally and John, that golden hour passed in 1995 without anyone realizing a crime had even occurred. Because of the postcard, perhaps. Because she was a sex worker and her temporary absence might not have seemed immediately alarming. Because in 1995, the infrastructure for tracking missing persons wasn't what it is today. By the time anyone truly suspected foul play, days had passed. Then weeks. Then months. Evidence degrades. Rain washes away traces. Witnesses forget details. Security footage, if it existed, gets recorded over. The trail goes cold not because investigators stop caring, but because time itself becomes the enemy. That's the reality of cold cases. They're not usually cold because police gave up. They're cold because all the obvious leads ran out, and what remains requires either new evidence or old evidence seen in a new way. For Sally's case, the new way came in 2013, when someone decided to look at the disappearance with fresh eyes and modern tools. What changed between 1995 and 2013? Technology, certainly. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Databases expanded. The ability to cross-reference information across jurisdictions improved. But also, cultural awareness. In 1995, sex workers who went missing often fell through the cracks of public concern. There was a pervasive attitude, rarely spoken aloud but always present, that these women had chosen risky lifestyles and therefore bore some responsibility for what happened to them. It's a cruel logic. Victim blaming dressed up as moral judgment. By the 2010s, that attitude was changing. Slowly, painfully, but changing. Cases like those of the Ipswich victims, 5 sex workers murdered in 2006 by Steve Wright, had forced a national conversation about how society views vulnerable women. The revelation that Christopher Halliwell had targeted sex workers in Swindon, that he'd killed at least 2 and possibly more, created local pressure to review other cases of missing women. Sally's name came up. Of course it did. A sex worker who'd vanished in the same town where Halliwell had operated. The same vulnerable population. The same streets. Even if Halliwell wasn't responsible, Sally's case deserved another look. Deserved the resources and attention that might not have been fully available in 1995. So they reviewed it. And what they found was significant enough to reclassify her disappearance as murder. But what exactly did they find? The police have been maddeningly tight-lipped about the specifics. In November 2014, when they announced the case was now a murder investigation, Detective Inspector Tim Corner said they'd established significant new lines of inquiry during the review. But he didn't say what those lines of inquiry were. In the years since, despite multiple appeals and the revelation about the postcard, police have never publicly detailed what evidence convinced them Sally was murdered. This could mean several things. 1. The evidence is sensitive and releasing it could compromise the investigation. Maybe it involves witness testimony that needs to be protected. Maybe it's forensic evidence that only the killer would know about, and revealing it would tip them off. 2. The evidence is strong enough to convince detectives but not strong enough to charge anyone yet. Maybe it's circumstantial. Maybe it points in a direction but doesn't definitively prove anything. 3. The evidence is connected to ongoing inquiries, possibly into other crimes or other suspects. Revealing it might connect dots the police aren't ready to connect publicly. Any of these scenarios is plausible. All of them are frustrating for anyone trying to understand what really happened to Sally. But there's one piece of evidence we do know about, the postcard. And analyzing it might tell us more than the police have explicitly stated. Let's examine the postcard more carefully. The text, as revealed by police. Hi Clive, just to let you know I am all right. I have moved away from Swindon and moved to London. I am all right, so stop worrying about me. I'm okay, big boy. Love, Sally Ann. First observation, repetition. I am all right appears twice. I'm okay is a third reassurance. That's a lot of emphasis on being fine. Almost too much. In genuine communication, people rarely over-reassure unless they're responding to specific concern. But if the postcard was sent shortly after Sally's disappearance, before anyone had reported her missing, why the multiple assurances? Unless the postcard was sent later, after people had started asking questions. After Clive had expressed worry. Or unless the forger was trying too hard. Overcompensating. Making sure the message was received, she's fine. Stop looking. Second observation, moved away from Swindon and moved to London. The redundancy is awkward. Moved away from Swindon or moved to London would be natural. Both together feels excessive. Like the forger wanted to be absolutely clear about the geography. Why? Maybe to direct any search efforts away from Swindon. To make people think she was in London, a city of millions where someone could disappear into anonymity. Third observation, I'm okay, big boy. This is the most personal part of the message. The nickname. The intimacy. If you're forging a postcard, you might get the general tone right. You might know Sally had moved to London or was planning to. But a nickname. That's specific. That's knowledge that comes from either hearing Sally use it, or from being someone she'd use it with. This suggests the forger had close access to Sally's relationship with Clive. Either they'd overheard conversations, or they were part of Sally's inner circle, or, and this is the most disturbing possibility, they were Clive himself. I need to be very careful here. There is no public evidence that Clive is a suspect. The fact that he came forward with the postcard suggests cooperation with police. Suggesting otherwise without evidence is irresponsible. But in any murder investigation, everyone close to the victim gets scrutinized. That's not prejudice, it's statistics. Most people are killed by someone they know. So detectives would have looked at Clive. Would have asked, where was he the night Sally disappeared? What was his relationship with her really? Why did Sally, or the forger, choose to send the postcard to him specifically? If Clive had an alibi, if he was cooperative, if there was no evidence connecting him to Sally's death, then he'd be eliminated as a suspect and treated as a witness. But we don't know if that happened because the police haven't said. What we can say is this, the postcard represents knowledge. Personal, intimate knowledge. And that knowledge had to come from somewhere. Let's shift perspective for a moment. Imagine you're the killer. You've just murdered Sally and John. Maybe it was planned. Maybe it happened in a moment of rage or panic. Either way, she's dead and you need to figure out what to do next. The body is the first problem. You can't leave it where it is. Too risky. So you take it somewhere. Somewhere you have access to. Somewhere you can hide it effectively enough that it won't be found. That requires transportation. A vehicle. And a location, a burial site, a body of water, a building with a cellar or crawl space, somewhere remote. You succeed. The body is hidden. But now you face the second problem: people will notice Sally is missing. If you do nothing, if you just stay silent, the police will investigate. They'll interview her friends, her clients, anyone who saw her that night. They'll check CCTV. They'll search areas around where she was last seen. You need to buy time. You need to make people think she's alive and chose to leave. So you write a postcard. You try to mimic her handwriting, or you don't worry about it too much because who's going to forensically analyze a postcard from a missing sex worker in 1995? You make it casual. Reassuring. You include details that make it plausible: London, starting over, don't worry. And you send it to Clive because, why? This is where the psychology gets interesting. Maybe Clive was asking questions. Maybe Clive was the person most likely to push for a serious investigation. So you send the postcard to him specifically to quiet his concerns. Or maybe you send it to Clive because that's who Sally would have written to. Because he was important to her. Because a postcard to anyone else wouldn't make sense. Or maybe, and this is darker, you send it to Clive to hurt him. To make him believe Sally was fine and just didn't want to see him anymore. To add psychological cruelty to murder. Any of these motivations tells us something about the killer. About their thought process. About their relationship to both Sally and Clive. The postcard worked, in a sense. For years, people believed it. Or at least, some people did. The police noted it in their file. Maybe the investigation lost urgency because of it. Sally's family probably didn't believe it. Parents know their children in ways that postcards can counterfeit. The very fact that Sally would write to Clive but not to them must have seemed wrong. But without proof, what could they do except wait and hope? The postcard bought the killer time. Years, as it turned out. Nearly 2 decades before forensic analysis proved it was forged. That's a long time to live with murder. A long time to wake up every morning knowing what you did. A long time to see Sally's missing person appeals on local news and know that you're the reason for her absence. Unless you're a psychopath, someone incapable of guilt or empathy, that knowledge would eat at you. Most killers aren't psychopaths. Most are ordinary people who did something terrible and then have to live with it. They make mistakes. They drink too much and say things they shouldn't. They develop patterns of behavior, controlling, violent, deceptive, that show up in other relationships. They might have told someone. A friend. A partner. Someone they trusted in a moment of weakness. And that someone is living with it too. Living with the knowledge that the person they care about is a murderer. Deciding every day whether to stay silent or come forward. That's what the police appeals are aimed at. Not just potential witnesses who saw something suspicious, but people who know. Who suspect. Who've been carrying a terrible secret and might finally be ready to put it down. In 2017, alongside the postcard revelation, police released new details about Sally's movements in the days before she disappeared. They revealed that she'd been working in Swindon town centre on the evening of September 8, 1995, between the bus station and train station, details we already knew. But they also mentioned she'd been seen in other areas of Swindon in the weeks prior. She'd been spotted in the town centre, in residential areas, in places that weren't part of her usual working territory. Why release this information 22 years later? Maybe because investigators wanted to jog memories. Wanted people who'd seen Sally in those weeks to come forward and fill in gaps. Or maybe because those sightings were significant. Maybe Sally had been followed. Maybe someone had been tracking her movements, learning her patterns, planning. If the latter is true, it suggests premeditation on a disturbing scale. Not an opportunistic killing, but something calculated. Someone watching and waiting. There's another theory that occasionally surfaces in online discussions of the case. What if Sally wasn't killed on September 8 at all? What if she was abducted that night but kept alive for some period of time? The postcard could have been written under duress. Sally could have been forced to write it, or to provide information about Clive that was then used to forge it. This theory is deeply uncomfortable to contemplate. It suggests not just murder, but extended captivity. Prolonged suffering. Is there evidence for it? Not publicly. The police have never suggested Sally was held captive before being killed. But the timeline of the postcard is fuzzy. We don't know exactly when it was sent. If there was a gap of days or even weeks between Sally's disappearance and her death, the postcard could have been part of that terrible interim. I raise this not to sensationalize, but because the truth is we don't know. The police might know, based on evidence they haven't released. But we don't. And that uncertainty, that space where horrible possibilities live, is part of what makes this case so haunting. Let me tell you about the 3 arrests in September 2015. The media coverage was brief and carefully worded. 3 men, all in their 50s, arrested on suspicion of kidnap and murder. Taken into custody simultaneously, which suggests coordinated raids. Multiple locations. This wasn't a fishing expedition. The police had something. Some reason to believe these 3 specific men were involved. But then, release. All 3. No charges. The statement from Wiltshire Police, released pending further inquiries. That phrase is important. Not released without suspicion. Not eliminated from the investigation. Just pending further inquiries. Which means the police still considered them persons of interest. They just didn't have enough to charge them yet. So who were these men? We don't know their names. We don't know their connection to Sally. We don't know if they were 3 individuals working together, or 3 separate suspects investigated simultaneously. Were they clients? People from Sally's social circle? Residents of the area where she was last seen? The fact that all 3 were in their 50s in 2015 means they'd have been in their 30s in 1995. The right age to be involved. Old enough to have had vehicles, resources, the ability to dispose of a body. But beyond that, it's speculation. What we can infer is that the police had reasons, plural, to suspect multiple people. Either they believed it was a group crime, or they had several viable suspects and hadn't yet determined which was responsible. The coordinated nature of the arrest suggests urgency. Maybe they were worried about suspects communicating with each other. Maybe they hoped to create pressure, to get one to turn on the others. It didn't work. Or at least, it hasn't worked yet. All 3 men are presumably still out there. Living their lives. Maybe in Swindon, maybe elsewhere. One of them, maybe all of them, might be innocent. Wrongly suspected. Investigated and cleared, their lives disrupted by a murder inquiry that went nowhere. Or one of them killed Sally and John and has been free for nearly 3 decades. There's a particular cruelty to unsolved murders that extends far beyond the immediate victim. Sally's family has lived in limbo for 29 years. Not knowing where her body is. Not knowing if she suffered. Not knowing who took her from them or why. Leslie, Sally's mother, has given interviews over the years. Each one a fresh wound. Each one an exercise in maintaining hope while accepting the worst. In one interview from 2017, she said, "I still think of her every day. For years I have wondered where she could be and I have had to deal with the thought that she might have been killed. Might have been killed." Even then, even after the police had reclassified the case as murder, even after forensic searches and arrests, Leslie couldn't quite bring herself to use the definitive past tense. Might have been, instead of was. That's what hope looks like when it's been beaten down but refuses to die completely. The not knowing becomes its own torture. Because at least with certainty, even terrible certainty, you can grieve. You can have a funeral. You can begin the slow process of accepting loss. But without a body, without confirmation, you're stuck. Every knock on the door might be her. Every stranger on the street might have her eyes, her walk, her voice. You see her everywhere and nowhere at once. And it's not just the family who suffers. The friends who knew Sally in those final months, the other women who worked the same streets, who shared the same struggles, they've had to carry this too. Some of them are dead now. Drug overdoses. Violence. The hard life that sex work often is, especially for women without resources or support. Others got out. Found different ways to survive. Maybe got clean, found housing, rebuilt their lives. But they remember. They remember Sally's smile. Her warmth. The way she could make a bad night feel less heavy. And they remember the fear that settled over Swindon's sex-working community after she disappeared. If it could happen to Sally, bright, careful Sally, it could happen to anyone. That fear isn't abstract. It's not paranoia. It's the lived reality of women who navigate danger as part of their daily existence. Every car they get into is a gamble. Every client is a potential threat. Most are fine. Sad, lonely, looking for something that might pass for connection. But some aren't fine. Some are violent. Some are killers. And you can't always tell which is which until it's too late. The statistics around murdered sex workers are grim and incomplete. In the UK, sex workers are 12 times more likely to be murdered than the general population. 12 times. And those are just the murders we know about. How many women have disappeared like Sally and never been counted in official statistics because they were never confirmed as homicides? How many are buried in unmarked graves, their cases filed away as missing persons because there was no body to prove murder? The National Crime Agency estimates there could be hundreds of undetected serial murders in the UK. Not all targeting sex workers, but a significant proportion doing exactly that. Because sex workers are vulnerable. They work alone. They go with strangers to isolated locations. They're often estranged from family or lacking strong support networks that would immediately notice their absence. They're, in the coldest possible terms, easier to kill and easier to get away with killing. This isn't to say Sally's murder was necessarily part of a serial pattern. But it's context that matters. Understanding why her case might not have received full attention initially. Understanding why the postcard might have worked to divert suspicion. Understanding why, even now, even with modern resources and renewed attention, her case remains unsolved. Let's return to Christopher Halliwell for a moment. I mentioned him earlier, but his relevance to Sally's case, or lack thereof, deserves deeper examination. Halliwell was arrested in March 2011 for the murder of Sion O'Callaghan, a 22-year-old who disappeared after leaving a nightclub in Swindon. Under questioning, he led police to Sion's body. But then he said something that changed everything. Do you want another one? He led detectives to a second body. Becky Godden-Edwards, who'd been missing since 2003. She'd been a sex worker in Swindon. She was 20 years old when she disappeared. Halliwell had buried her in a field in East Leach, Gloucestershire. She'd been there for 8 years before he revealed her location. The circumstances of his confession created legal problems. The arresting officer, Detective Superintendent Steve Wiltshire, had broken protocol by continuing to question Halliwell outside of a police station without a solicitor present. This ultimately cost Wiltshire his career and meant Halliwell couldn't be immediately prosecuted for Becky's murder. But the confession revealed something terrifying. Halliwell had killed before. He'd kept it secret for years. He'd driven his taxi around Swindon with Becky's body buried in a field and no one knew. And then he made that cryptic comment to Wiltshire, "Do you want me to tell you about them all?" Them all. Multiple victims. How many? Halliwell never elaborated. He went silent. Refused to discuss other potential murders. But investigators started looking at his history. Where he'd lived. Where he'd worked. The timeline of his movements. And they found disturbing patterns. Halliwell had worked as a taxi driver in Swindon for years. Since the early 1980s, in fact. His routes would have taken him through the exact areas where sex workers operated. The bus station. The train station. Alexandra Street. The same streets where Sally was last seen in 1995. More, Halliwell had a history of using sex workers. Multiple women identified him as a client. Some described him as strange, unsettling, someone who made them uncomfortable. One sex worker told police that Halliwell had picked her up in 2002 and driven her to a remote location. She'd felt such intense fear that she'd managed to escape from his moving vehicle and run. She'd been lucky. Others weren't. In 2016, Halliwell was finally convicted of murdering Becky Godden. The judge, sentencing him to life, said it was highly likely he'd killed other women. Highly likely. Since then, police have investigated potential links between Halliwell and at least a dozen unsolved murders and disappearances. Sally and John's name is on that list. But here's the problem, investigators have never publicly confirmed any link between Halliwell and Sally. They've looked. They've investigated. But they haven't said they found evidence connecting him to her disappearance. Which could mean one of several things. Possibility 1, Halliwell has been ruled out. Maybe he has an alibi for September 8, 1995. Maybe he was in custody, or verifiably somewhere else. Maybe the forensic evidence, whatever it is, doesn't match his pattern. Possibility 2, Halliwell remains a suspect, but police can't prove it. He's already serving life without parole. Without new evidence, there's no point in publicly naming him as a suspect in cases they can't prosecute. Possibility 3, Halliwell isn't responsible, but police are keeping that conclusion quiet to avoid closing doors prematurely. If they publicly eliminate him as a suspect, the real killer might feel safer, less worried about eventual discovery. Possibility 4, the investigation is more complex than simple yes or no. Maybe Halliwell knew something about what happened to Sally without being directly responsible. Maybe there are connections police are still exploring. We don't know which possibility is accurate because, again, the police haven't said. What we can examine is whether Halliwell fits the known facts of Sally's case. Does Halliwell's method match what we know about Sally's murder? Sian O'Callaghan was abducted from a nightclub area, driven to a remote location, and killed. Her body was hidden but relatively accessible. Becky Godden was last seen getting into a vehicle in Swindon's red light district. Halliwell took her to East Leach, killed her, and buried her in a field. Both murders involved vehicles. Both involved women being taken from populated areas to remote locations. Both involved bodies being hidden in outdoor settings. If Sally was killed by the same person, you'd expect a similar pattern. Abducted from Alexandra Street. Driven somewhere isolated. Killed and buried. Her body never found suggests it was well hidden. Somewhere remote, or somewhere that's since been built over, or somewhere underwater. That matches Halliwell's capability. He had the means, a vehicle. He had knowledge of rural areas around Swindon. He'd proven he could keep a terrible secret for years. So yes, from a methodological standpoint, Halliwell fits. But what about the postcard? This is where Halliwell starts to not fit. The forged postcard represents a level of involvement in Sally's life that doesn't match Halliwell's known pattern. He killed strangers or near strangers. Women he picked up as clients. The relationships were transactional, brief, ending in violence. He didn't forge messages from his victims. He didn't try to create elaborate cover stories. He just killed them and stayed quiet. The postcard suggests intimate knowledge. Knowledge of Clive. Knowledge of Sally's relationships and how to manipulate them. That's not Halliwell's style. He was a blunt instrument. Pick up a woman, drive to a remote location, kill her, hide the body, return to normal life. Unless Sally's murder came earlier in his evolution as a killer. Unless in 1995, he was less confident, more worried about being caught, more inclined to create misdirection. It's possible. Serial killers do evolve. Their methods can change over time as they gain confidence or as circumstances change. But it feels like a stretch. It requires us to assume Halliwell was once more sophisticated than he later became. That he devolved from complex deception to simple brutality. Usually, it's the other way around. Killers start sloppy and get more efficient. There's another consideration, timing. Halliwell's confirmed kills are Sian in 2011 and Becky sometime between 2003 and 2005. If he also killed Sally in 1995, that's a gap of at least 8 years between victims. Serial killers can have gaps in their patterns. Life circumstances, marriage, employment, incarceration for other crimes, can interrupt their activities. But an 8-year gap followed by another 6-year gap before Becky, then another 6 years before Sian. It's an unusual pattern. Not impossible, but unusual. Most serial killers, once they start, accelerate. The time between kills decreases as they become more compulsive, more confident, more consumed by their urges. Halliwell's pattern, if it includes Sally, suggests remarkable control. Long periods of apparent dormancy punctuated by murder. Again, possible. But it doesn't quite fit the typical profile. So where does that leave us on Halliwell? He remains a person of interest, presumably. He should be. Any unsolved murder of a sex worker in Swindon during the period he was active deserves scrutiny through the lens of his known crimes. But he's probably not the answer to Sally's case. Not definitively ruled out, but not the most likely suspect either. Which brings us back to the more disturbing possibility: Sally's killer is someone else. Someone who's never been caught for any crime. Someone who's been living a normal life for 3 decades while Sally's family suffers. Someone who might still be in Swindon. Think about that for a moment. If Halliwell didn't kill Sally, then her murderer is someone who killed once, or at least, only once that we know of, and stopped. Or got better at hiding it. Or moved away. Or died. But if they're still alive, still in the area, they've spent 29 years watching the investigation from the outside. They saw the initial missing person reports. They watched the case go cold. They felt the relief when years passed without discovery. Then they saw the case reopened in 2013. Felt the anxiety return. They saw it reclassified as murder in 2014. Knew the police were taking it seriously again. They might have panicked when their former address was searched in 2015. Wondered what the police were looking for. Whether anything had been left behind all those years ago that could still incriminate them. They saw the arrests in September 2015 and wondered if they were about to be caught. Felt relief, or perhaps disappointment, when the suspects were released without charge. And then, in 2017, they saw the postcard revelation. Saw police announce that the handwriting wasn't Sally's. Saw their attempt at misdirection exposed publicly. Did that terrify them? Did they wonder how close the police were getting? Or did they feel confident? 22 years had passed and they still hadn't been caught. Maybe the postcard revelation didn't matter because all the other evidence was long gone. Living with murder changes you. I'm not talking about the act itself, the moment of violence, the decision to take a life. I'm talking about the after. The days and weeks and years that follow. Some killers are caught quickly. Within hours or days, the evidence leads back to them and their secret life as a murderer lasts only briefly. But others live with it for decades. They go to work. They interact with neighbors. They attend family gatherings, go to pubs, shop at supermarkets. They move through the world like everyone else. But they're not like everyone else. They're carrying something. A knowledge that separates them fundamentally from the people around them. They know what it feels like to end a life. They know where a body is hidden. They know they've destroyed a family and gotten away with it. That knowledge does things to a person. Some killers are psychopaths, neurologically different, incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. For them, murder might not weigh heavily. It's just something that happened. Something they did because they wanted to and could. But most killers aren't psychopaths. Studies suggest only about 15 to 20% of murderers meet the clinical criteria. The rest are people who, for whatever reason, rage, fear, sexual compulsion, desperation, killed someone and then had to figure out how to live with what they'd done. And that's when the patterns start to show. Increased drinking. Drug use. Anything to quiet the thoughts that come in the early hours of the morning when sleep won't come. Relationship problems. Difficulty maintaining intimacy when you're hiding something this enormous. Partners who sense something's wrong but can't identify what. Controlling behavior. Having taken ultimate control once, over someone's life and death, some killers try to exert control in other relationships. Domestic violence. Coercive behavior. Patterns that might bring them to police attention for other reasons. Religious conversion or intense spirituality. Some killers seek forgiveness or meaning, trying to balance the scales in ways that don't involve actual confession. Or the opposite, nihilism. A hardening. If you can kill once and get away with it, moral boundaries start to seem arbitrary. Any of these patterns, in someone who was in Swindon in 1995, who knew Sally or had access to her, might be worth investigating. But here's the terrible truth: you can't arrest someone for drinking too much or being a bad partner or suddenly finding religion. You need evidence. Physical evidence linking them to the crime. And in Sally's case, that evidence is sparse. No body means no crime scene. No murder weapon. No forensic traces that can be definitively tied to a specific person. The postcard is evidence, yes. But it proves someone forged a message, not necessarily who killed Sally. Those could theoretically be separate people, though it strains credibility to imagine they're not connected. The 2015 searches of Sally's flat found nothing that could be used prosecutorially. Or if they did, the police haven't revealed it. The 3 arrests in 2015 didn't lead to charges, which suggests whatever evidence police had wasn't sufficient for prosecution. So we're left with a situation where police likely have suspicions, maybe even strong suspicions, but can't prove them. And the killer, if they're aware of this, might feel safe. Might believe they've gotten away with it. There's a concept in investigative psychology called investigative awareness. It refers to a suspect's knowledge of forensic techniques and investigative procedures. The more aware someone is, the better they can avoid detection. In 1995, investigative awareness in the general public was lower than it is now. DNA analysis was less sophisticated. CCTV was less ubiquitous. The internet wasn't yet a factor in most investigations. Someone who killed Sally in 1995 wouldn't have needed to be particularly sophisticated to avoid leaving traces. Basic caution, gloves, avoiding witnesses, disposing of the body in a remote location, might have been enough. But that same person, if they're still alive, has watched investigative technology advance over 3 decades. They've seen DNA analysis become routine. They've watched true crime documentaries explaining how cold cases get solved. They've learned what mistakes killers make and how to avoid them. If there was evidence at the time, clothing fibers, DNA under fingernails, anything that might have been preserved, the killer knows it's still out there, waiting to be tested with modern techniques. That knowledge must create a particular kind of anxiety. Every new development in forensic science, every announcement about a cold case being solved through genealogical DNA matching. The knowledge that their crime, committed in 1995, might still catch up with them in 2025 or 2030 or whenever the right piece of evidence gets re-examined with the right technology. Let's talk about what we don't know. We don't know how Sally died. Was it strangulation? Blunt force trauma? Stabbing? Something else? The manner of death might tell us something about the killer's state of mind. Strangulation is personal, intimate, requires sustained contact. Blunt force can be rage-driven, explosive. Stabbing can be either, frenzied or cold. Without a body, we can't know. We don't know where Sally died. Was it in a vehicle? A residence? Somewhere outdoors? Location matters because it suggests planning. If she died in a car, it might have been a client encounter gone wrong. If she died in someone's home, it suggests she went there willingly, which narrows the suspect pool to people she trusted. We don't know where Sally's body is. Despite searches, despite ground-penetrating radar, despite decades of looking, she's never been found. That suggests either exceptional luck on the killer's part, or exceptional knowledge of where to hide someone. Bodies turn up. Construction projects uncover them. Erosion exposes them. Hikers stumble across them. But not always. Some remain hidden forever. Sally might be in the countryside around Swindon, buried in woodland, submerged in water, somewhere rural where human disturbance is minimal. Or she might be closer. Buried in a garden that's since been paved over. Concealed in a building that's since been demolished or renovated. Or she might not be in Swindon at all. The killer might have transported her body significant distance. To another county. To another country, even. Without knowing, the search area is essentially infinite. We don't know who the 3 arrested men were. This feels particularly significant. 3 simultaneous arrests suggests either A. The police suspected a group crime, multiple people working together to kill and dispose of Sally. Or B. The police had 3 separate suspects and weren't sure which was responsible, so they brought all 3 in hoping one would break or evidence would emerge to distinguish them. Group crimes involving murder are relatively rare outside of organized crime or gang activity. They require coordination, trust that co-conspirators won't talk, shared motive. What motive would multiple people have to kill Sally? Unless it was accidental. Unless something happened, a party, a drug situation, something that went wrong, and multiple people were involved in covering it up. The postcard, in this scenario, might have been a collaborative effort. Different people contributing information about Sally's life, about Clive, forging the message together. It's a disturbing possibility. Because if multiple people are responsible, they've all kept the secret for nearly 3 decades. That's remarkable consistency. Remarkable loyalty to each other, or remarkable fear of what confession would mean. Or option B, 3 separate suspects. Maybe the police had information pointing to different individuals. Maybe witness statements conflicted. Maybe forensic evidence was ambiguous. So they arrested all 3 simultaneously, hoping the shock and isolation of arrest would prompt a confession. It didn't work. All 3 were released. All 3 presumably lawyered up. All 3 exercised their right to silence or provided explanations that couldn't be disproven. And the police were left with suspicion but not certainty. This scenario raises a question: are those 3 men still being monitored? Is surveillance ongoing? Are police waiting for one of them to make a mistake, to say something incriminating, to lead investigators to evidence? Or has that avenue of investigation been exhausted? We don't know. Here's what keeps me thinking about this case. Sally and John should have been found by now. 29 years is a long time. Deathbed confessions happen. Guilty consciences break. Relationships end and people talk out of spite. Construction projects uncover bodies. The statistical likelihood of a murder remaining unsolved this long, especially after intensive reinvestigation, suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary circumstances. What circumstances? Possibility 1, the killer died before they could be identified. Dead people don't confess. Dead people can't be prosecuted. If the person responsible died in 1996 or 2000 or 2010, the case might never be solved. Possibility 2, the killer left the UK entirely. Emigrated. Lives in another country now. Beyond reach of British law enforcement, or at least practically difficult to extradite. Possibility 3, the killer is in prison for other crimes. This happens more often than you'd think. Someone commits murder, gets away with it, then later gets caught for something else. The earlier murder might not be connected to them because they weren't a suspect at the time. Possibility 4, the person responsible has resources or connections that have helped them stay ahead of the investigation. Money for lawyers. Family members in positions to help. Some advantage that makes them harder to touch. Possibility 5, there genuinely is no remaining evidence. The killer was careful, lucky, or both. Everything that could identify them has degraded, been destroyed, or was never preserved in the first place. Any of these could explain why Sally's case remains unsolved despite modern forensics and renewed attention. But there's another possibility I haven't mentioned yet. What if the killer is someone seemingly beyond suspicion? Think about it. Police investigate based on probability. They look at known associates. People with criminal records. Individuals who fit certain profiles. But what if Sally's killer doesn't fit any profile? What if there's someone who, in 1995 and still today, would seem like the last person to commit murder? A respected professional. A family man. Someone active in the community. Someone whose social position creates an unconscious bias against suspecting them. History is full of killers who hid in plain sight precisely because their public persona was so incompatible with murder that no one thought to look closely. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was a church council president and compliance officer. Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, was a former police officer. John Wayne Gacy was a community volunteer who dressed as a clown for children's parties. All of them were killers. All of them used their respectable facades to deflect suspicion. Could Sally's killer be someone similar? Someone whose position or reputation has shielded them from serious investigation. It would explain why the case remains unsolved despite evidence that led to arrests. Maybe the evidence points towards someone police are reluctant to fully investigate without ironclad proof. Maybe that's why the 3 arrests didn't lead to charges. Maybe the suspects, or one of them, had resources to fight back legally, to create reasonable doubt, to make prosecution too risky. I'm speculating now. I acknowledge that. Without inside knowledge of the investigation, without access to police files, all we can do is theorize based on the limited public information. But that's what Sally's case has become. A series of questions without answers. A puzzle with missing pieces. And in the absence of facts, people fill in gaps with theories. Some are plausible. Some are wild. Some are probably close to the truth. Others are nowhere near it. But they all share one thing: they keep Sally's name alive. They keep people talking about her case. They maintain pressure on investigators to keep looking. Because the alternative, forgetting, moving on, accepting that some mysteries never get solved, feels like abandoning Sally a second time. There's been one more development in recent years that deserves mention. In 2019, Wiltshire Police announced they were conducting a forensic review of multiple unsolved murders, including Sally's case. The review involved re-examining physical evidence with modern DNA techniques. Specifically, they were using genealogical DNA matching, the same technique that solved the Golden State Killer case in California. This technique takes DNA from crime scenes and compares it against genetic genealogy databases. Not to directly identify a suspect, but to find relatives. Then, through traditional investigation, police narrow down which family member might be responsible. It's revolutionary. It solved dozens of cold cases. And it requires only trace amounts of DNA, less than older techniques needed. If there's any preserved DNA evidence from Sally's case, from the postcard, from her flat, from anywhere, this technique might finally identify her killer. But there's been no announcement of a breakthrough. No arrests following the 2019 review. Which might mean A. No usable DNA was preserved. B. The DNA didn't match anyone in the databases. C. The DNA matched someone, but other evidence doesn't support prosecution yet. D. The investigation is ongoing and police aren't ready to announce findings. Again, we don't know. There's a photograph I haven't mentioned yet. Not of Sally herself, though we've discussed that one. The image police circulated, her smile frozen in time, forever 23. This is a photograph of the street. Alexandra Street at night. Taken years after Sally disappeared, but the geography is the same. Streetlights casting pools of yellow light on wet pavement. The bus station in the background, its windows glowing. A few pedestrians, blurred by movement. Cars passing through the frame. It's an ordinary street in an ordinary town. Nothing sinister about it at all. But looking at that photograph, knowing what happened there, or near there, transforms it. Suddenly every shadow feels loaded with possibility. Every parked car becomes a potential crime scene. Every passerby might be the last person to see someone alive. That's what murder does to geography. It haunts it. The people who walk down Alexandra Street today, who catch buses or trains or just cut through on their way somewhere else, most of them have no idea. No idea that a young woman vanished from this exact spot in 1995. No idea that they're walking through what might be the last place Sally and John stood as a free person. Geography remembers even when people forget. Sally's mother, Leslie, is in her late 70s now. Think about what that means. She's lived more than a third of her life without her daughter. She's aged from middle age to elderly while Sally remains forever 23 in photographs and memories. She's outlived the normal expectation of how these things work. Parents aren't supposed to outlive their children. Parents aren't supposed to spend decades not knowing where their child is buried. In one interview, Leslie spoke about the toll of not knowing. Every day I wake up and I think about Sally. Every day I go to bed thinking about her. That never stops. That never stops. Imagine the weight of that. 29 years of waking up and going to sleep with the same unanswered question. 29 years of hoping for closure while fearing what closure might actually look like. Because closure, in this case, means confirmation that Sally is dead. Means finding her remains. Means finally knowing what happened, but also means the end of any possibility, however microscopic, that she's somehow still alive. Hope is cruel that way. It refuses to die even when logic says it should. Even when every rational assessment says your loved one has been dead for decades, some small part of you keeps expecting them to walk through the door. Leslie deserves answers. She deserves to know where her daughter is. She deserves to bury Sally properly, to have a grave to visit, to have the full truth instead of fragments and theories. She deserves justice. But deserving something and getting it are different things entirely. Let's talk about the psychology of coming forward. If someone knows something about Sally's murder, witnessed something, heard something, suspects something, why haven't they spoken up? There are several possible reasons. Fear. If they witnessed something, they might be afraid of the killer. Afraid of retaliation. This fear might have been acute in 1995 and has simply become habitual over the years. They've stayed silent so long that speaking now feels impossible. Loyalty. If the person they suspect is someone they love, a partner, family member, close friend, the conflict between loyalty and justice becomes excruciating. Do you destroy someone you love to help someone you didn't know? Uncertainty. Maybe they saw something suspicious but aren't sure it's connected to Sally's disappearance. A car in an unusual place. Someone acting strangely. Without confirmation that it's relevant, coming forward feels like wasting police time or causing trouble for someone who might be innocent. Self-incrimination. If speaking up would reveal their own illegal activities, drug use, soliciting sex workers, other crimes, they might choose silence to protect themselves. Trauma. Sometimes people witness something so disturbing that they psychologically bury it. Repression isn't as common as pop psychology suggests, but it happens. Years later, the memory might be fragmentary, dreamlike, hard to trust. Guilt. If they could have prevented something and didn't, if they saw Sally get into a car and didn't think anything of it at the time, the guilt of that might keep them silent. Admitting what they saw means admitting they didn't help when they could have. Any of these reasons might explain decades of silence. But the police appeals are designed to address these barriers. They offer anonymity. They emphasize that even small details matter. They create opportunities for people to come forward without directly involving themselves. And still, the crucial information, whatever it is, hasn't emerged. Which suggests either no one knows anything useful, or someone knows everything and is absolutely committed to keeping it secret. There's a particular kind of person who kills someone and then lives normally afterward. Not a psychopath necessarily, though they exist. I'm talking about someone who compartmentalizes. Who puts the murder in a mental box and closes it. Who goes on with their life as if it never happened. It requires a specific psychological skill set. The ability to separate your actions from your self-concept. To tell yourself, that was a different person. That was a moment in time. That's not who I am. The ability to justify. To create a narrative where what happened was somehow necessary, or deserved, or not really your fault. She shouldn't have been there. Things got out of hand. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. The ability to live with cognitive dissonance. To attend funerals and express sympathy for missing persons while knowing you're the reason they're missing. To see appeals on television and feel nothing, or to feel something but suppress it. Most people can't do this. Most people who kill someone carry it visibly. In their behavior, their relationships, their mental health. But some people can. Some people kill and then go right back to their lives without visible disruption. Those are the hardest cases to solve. Because the investigation looks for signs of guilt, signs of change, signs of someone struggling with what they've done. And if the killer shows none of those signs, they become invisible. I keep coming back to the postcard. It's the detail that transforms this case from tragic to sinister. From a likely murder to a calculated deception. Someone sat down, probably at a desk or table, probably in private, and wrote that message. Tried to sound like Sally. Tried to predict what she might say if she'd actually left for London. Hi Clive, just to let you know I am all right. Imagine writing that. Imagine forming each letter, knowing the person you're pretending to be is dead. Knowing you killed them, or know who did. Imagine signing it, Love Sally Ann. Adding the kisses at the end. The small touches of affection that make it believable. What kind of psychological state allows you to do that? Some killers panic after the act. They make mistakes. They flee. They confess. This person wrote a postcard. Calm. Deliberate. Patient enough to let it arrive, to let it do its work, to let people believe Sally was alive and well in London. That level of composure suggests someone who'd thought this through. Who'd planned for discovery. Who understood that making Sally's disappearance look voluntary was the best way to avoid serious investigation. And it worked. For nearly 20 years, until forensic analysis proved the postcard was forged, it worked. Let's consider a timeline of the killer's experience. September 8, 1995, something happens to Sally. Whether planned or spontaneous, she's killed. The killer has to deal with the immediate aftermath. The body. The disposal. The cleanup. Days later, the postcard is sent. This might have been prepared in advance, or it might have been created after Sally's death as a response to people starting to ask questions. Either way, it arrives and serves its purpose. Weeks later, police investigate but treat it as a missing person case. The killer watches, nervous but increasingly confident. No one suspects murder. The postcard worked. Months later, the investigation winds down. Life returns to normal. The killer has gotten away with it. Years later, 1996, 1997, 2000, Sally becomes a memory. The killer might think about her occasionally, anniversaries of her death, moments when guilt surfaces, but mostly life goes on. Career. Relationships. Normal existence. 2013, news breaks that police are reviewing the case. The first stirrings of anxiety. What new technology might they use? What might they find? 2014, case reclassified as murder. The killer knows now that this isn't going away. They're taking it seriously. Significant new information. What information? 2015, the flat is searched. Did the killer live there? Did something happen there? The search turns up nothing, but the anxiety must have been intense. September 2015, the arrests. 3 men. Is the killer one of them? If so, the interrogation. The lawyers. The decision to stay silent. The relief when they're released without charge. If the killer isn't one of the 3, they watch the arrests and wonder, who are these people? What do police think they know? 2017, the postcard revelation. Their attempt at deception exposed. But also, still no charges. Still no breakthrough. Still safe, probably. 2019, forensic review announced. DNA matching. The killer knows if they left any biological evidence, it might finally catch up to them. They wait. Nothing happens. 2024 to 2025, nearly 30 years since Sally died. The killer is older now. If they were 30 in 1995, they're 60 now. Retired, perhaps. Grandchildren. A whole life built on the foundation of a secret. Do they feel safe? Do they think about confessing? Do they plan to take it to their grave? There's a philosophical question embedded in all of this. If someone kills another person and is never caught, never punished, never faces justice, have they gotten away with it? In a legal sense, yes. If they die without being convicted, the case dies with them. But in every other sense, they've lived 30 years looking over their shoulder. 30 years knowing that a knock on the door might be the police. 30 years unable to talk about a significant event in their life because talking about it means confession. They've lived 30 years watching Sally's family suffer. Watching her mother age and grieve. Knowing they could end that suffering with the truth but choosing not to. They've lived 30 years with a secret that separates them from everyone they love. A fundamental dishonesty at the core of their existence. Is that getting away with it? Or is it just a different kind of prison? I don't know the answer. Maybe there isn't one. But I do know this, Sally and John didn't get to live these 30 years. She didn't get to age, to have relationships, to make mistakes and grow from them, to experience joy and sorrow and everything that makes a full life. She got 23 years. And then nothing. Whatever punishment her killer might or might not be experiencing, it's not proportional to what they took from her. Let me tell you something about cold cases that often goes unsaid. Most of them don't get solved. We hear about the successes, the DNA match after 40 years, the deathbed confession, the new witness who comes forward. We hear about those because they're news. They're feel-good stories about justice delayed but not denied. But for every cold case that gets solved, dozens don't. Maybe hundreds. They just remain open. Files in cabinets. Names in databases. Families waiting for answers that never come. Sally's case might be one of those. Not because police aren't trying. Not because investigators don't care. But because sometimes, despite everything, despite modern forensics and renewed attention and public appeals, the evidence just isn't there. The killer covered their tracks well enough, or got lucky enough, or died before justice could catch up. And the case stays unsolved forever. That's a hard truth. But it's worth acknowledging. Because the alternative, the constant expectation that justice will eventually prevail, can be its own form of torture for families waiting for resolution. But, and this is important, but sometimes cold cases do get solved. Sometimes the breakthrough comes after 30 years. Sometimes someone's conscience finally breaks. Sometimes a random construction project uncovers remains. Sometimes a new technology creates possibilities that didn't exist before. It happens. Not often enough. Not as often as we'd like. But it happens. The Golden State Killer was caught 44 years after his first known murder. James D'Angelo went decades thinking he'd gotten away with it. And then genealogical DNA caught up with him. Similar breakthroughs have solved cases from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Cases that seemed hopeless. Cases where witnesses were dead and evidence was degraded. And suddenly, unexpectedly, they break open. Sally's case could be next. There might be DNA preserved somewhere that hasn't been tested with the latest technology yet. There might be a witness who's been silent for 30 years but is finally ready to talk. There might be evidence that seems irrelevant now but will make sense when viewed in combination with something not yet discovered. The investigation isn't over. It's still open. Still active. And that means there's still hope for answers. There's a moment in every unsolved case where you have to confront what we actually know versus what we want to believe. We want to believe that evil always gets punished. That killers always get caught. That families always get closure. We want to believe that someone, somewhere, knows the truth and will eventually speak up. That justice is inevitable, just delayed. We want to believe that Sally's case will be solved. That her killer will be identified. That her body will be found and properly buried. That her mother will get answers before it's too late. But wanting something doesn't make it true. The reality is this: Sally and John disappeared on September 8, 1995. Someone killed her. Someone hid her body so well it's never been found. Someone forged a postcard to make people think she'd left voluntarily. And that someone has never been caught. 29 years of investigation. Hundreds of hours of police work. Modern forensics. Public appeals. Arrests. Searches. And still, no charges. No conviction. No resolution. That's the truth we have to sit with. But let me tell you what else is true. Sally and John was a person. Not a case number. Not a cautionary tale. Not a statistic about violence against sex workers. A person. She had a mother who loved her. Friends who remembered her warmth and humor. A life that, while troubled, was still hers. Still valuable. Still deserving of the same consideration and respect we'd give anyone else. The fact that she worked as a sex worker doesn't diminish her worth. It doesn't make her disappearance less tragic. It doesn't mean she deserved what happened to her or brought it on herself. She was vulnerable, yes. She was in a dangerous line of work. But vulnerability isn't an invitation to violence. Sally deserved to live. She deserved to get out of sex work, as she'd been planning. She deserved to have a future. Someone took that from her. And regardless of whether that person is ever caught, that fundamental injustice remains. The sex workers who knew Sally, who worked the same streets in the months and years after she vanished, they carried her memory. Some of them are gone now. Dead from the same risks Sally faced. Overdoses. Violence. The slow attrition of a hard life. But others survived. Got out. Found different ways to exist. And they remember. They remember what it felt like when Sally disappeared. The fear that settled over their community. The knowledge that if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. They remember the way police treated sex workers in the 1990s, with suspicion, with judgment, with the implicit message that their safety mattered less than other people's. Things have improved, slowly. Attitudes have shifted. There's more recognition now that sex workers are people deserving of protection, not people who forfeit protection by their choices. But in 1995, when Sally disappeared, that recognition was limited. And maybe that's part of why her case went cold initially. Maybe if she'd been a university student or a young professional, the investigation would have been more aggressive from the start. We can't know for certain. But we can acknowledge that bias exists. That it affects whose disappearance gets taken seriously and whose doesn't. Sally's case got a second chance in 2013. Got the investigation it should have received in 1995. But by then, crucial time had been lost. Witnesses had died or moved away. Memories had faded. Evidence had degraded. The injustice compounds. Let me tell you about the last time Sally's case made major headlines. It was March 2017 when police revealed the forged postcard. The story ran in multiple newspapers. The BBC covered it. Crime forums discussed it extensively. For a few weeks, Sally's name was everywhere again. And then, as these things do, it faded. Other cases. Other news. The constant churn of information that characterizes modern life. Sally's case returned to being something discussed primarily by true crime enthusiasts and cold case investigators. Something that occasionally surfaces when there's a new development or an anniversary. But for Sally's family, it never fades. It's always present. Always there. The absence that defines their lives. Leslie, Sally's mother, doesn't have the luxury of forgetting. Doesn't get to move on to the next case, the next story, the next thing. This is her life. This is what she wakes up to every morning and goes to sleep with every night. The not knowing. I think about that sometimes. About what it means to be the family member of someone who's been missing for decades. The practical aspects are strange. How do you handle their belongings? Do you keep their room as it was, or do you eventually pack things away? Do you maintain their grave, even though there's no body in it, or does that feel like accepting something you're not ready to accept? What do you say when people ask about your family? Do you mention Sally? Do you explain what happened, watch them become uncomfortable, navigate their awkward condolences? How do you celebrate holidays? Does Christmas always have an empty chair? Do birthdays pass with acknowledgement of the daughter who would have been 52 now, 53, 54? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are the actual, daily realities of being Sally's family. And they've lived with them for 29 years. There's a website that tracks unsolved murders in the UK. It lists hundreds of cases. Names and dates and brief summaries of people who died and whose killers were never caught. Sally and John is on that list. Somewhere between the murders that came before hers and the ones that came after. Each entry represents a person. A life. A family still waiting for answers. Reading through them is overwhelming. So many cases. So many families. So much unresolved grief. And those are just the ones that are definitively known to be murders. How many other people are listed as missing but were actually killed? How many cases were never investigated properly? How many victims never got justice? Sally is one of many. But she's not just one of many. She's specific. She's individual. She's irreplaceable. The fact that there are other unsolved cases doesn't diminish the importance of solving hers. If you've listened to this entire story, if you've stayed with me through all these words and all these questions, I want you to understand something. This isn't entertainment. I know we frame it that way. True crime. A genre. Something to listen to while commuting or doing chores or falling asleep. But these are real people. Real suffering. Real families who are still living with the consequences of these unsolved cases. Sally's mother is a real person who might hear this story. Who might listen to strangers discuss her daughter's murder and feel grateful that people still care, or feel violated that her grief has become content. The killer, if they're still alive, might hear this. Might listen to strangers piece together fragments of what they did and feel fear, or pride, or nothing at all. People who knew Sally might hear this. Might be transported back to 1995. Might remember things they've tried to forget. This is real. It matters. It's not just a story. So what now? Where do we go from here? For Sally's family, the waiting continues. Another year. Another appeal. Another anniversary of her disappearance without resolution. For investigators, the case remains open. New leads are followed up. Old evidence is periodically re-examined. The hope that something will eventually break. For the killer, if they're alive, life goes on. Another day of carrying the secret. Another day of wondering if today will be the day everything catches up. And for Sally. Sally is wherever her body was left. In the ground somewhere. In water. In some hidden place that's kept its secret for nearly 3 decades. She's waiting to be found. Waiting for someone to finally tell the truth. Waiting for justice that may never come. But here's what I believe. Someone knows something. Someone out there has information that could solve this case. Maybe they don't realize the significance of what they know. Maybe they've stayed silent out of fear or loyalty or uncertainty. But they know something. And that person needs to hear this. It's not too late. It's never too late to do the right thing. If you saw Sally get into a car on September 8, 1995, tell the police. If you heard someone you know talk about something that happened that night, tell the police. If you suspect someone in your life, someone you're close to, someone you love, tell the police. The weight of carrying that knowledge is heavier than the consequences of speaking up. The guilt of staying silent compounds over time. It doesn't get easier. And Sally's family deserves answers. They deserve to know where she is. They deserve to bury her properly. They deserve to stop wondering and start grieving properly. You can give them that. Wiltshire Police maintains a dedicated line for information about Sally's case. They've made it clear, no piece of information is too small. No detail is insignificant. Maybe you saw something that night and didn't think it mattered. Maybe you remember someone acting strangely around that time. Maybe you heard a rumor, a comment, something that stuck with you. Call them. You can remain anonymous. You don't have to get involved beyond providing information. You can do it in a way that protects you. But please. If you know something, anything, come forward. 29 years is long enough. There's a photo I keep thinking about. Not of Sally. Not of the street where she disappeared. Not of the postcard or the appeals or any of the case documentation. It's a photo I imagine. A photo that doesn't exist but should. It's Sally at 52. Gray in her hair, lines on her face earned by years of living. Smiling at something, a grandchild, maybe, or a friend's joke, or just the simple pleasure of a sunny day. She's older. She's lived. She's survived whatever struggles she faced in her 20s and moved beyond them. She's here. That's the photograph I imagine. The one stolen from existence by whoever killed her on September 8, 1995. Sally didn't get to grow old. Didn't get to see what her life might have become. Didn't get to surprise herself with her own resilience and strength. All of that was taken from her. And whoever took it has never answered for it. I said at the beginning that some people vanish quietly and others leave echoes that never fade. Sally and John left echoes. In her mother's voice when she speaks about still thinking of Sally every day. In the case files that investigators return to, hoping for a breakthrough. In the street where she was last seen, haunted now by what happened there. In the postcard that proved someone tried to make the world forget her. She left echoes. And those echoes refuse to fade. Because Sally deserves to be remembered. Not as a victim. Not as a tragedy. Not as an unsolved mystery. As a person. As Sally. As someone who mattered. This case will be solved eventually. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe in 10 years. Maybe after everyone currently involved is dead and some future investigator looks at it with fresh eyes and new technology. But it will be solved. I have to believe that. Because the alternative, accepting that some crimes just never get resolved, that some killers really do get away with it forever, is too bleak. Sally's killer made a mistake somewhere. Left some trace. Told someone something. Made some choice that will eventually connect them to her murder. It might take time. It might take luck. It might take someone's conscience finally breaking after decades of silence. But truth has a way of surfacing. Eventually. Inevitably. So this is where we leave the story. Not at an ending, because there isn't one yet. We leave it at a question that's been unanswered for 29 years. What happened to Sally and John? Someone knows. Someone reading this, or someone who knows someone reading this, or someone connected by degrees of separation we can't predict. Someone knows. And when that person finally speaks, when the silence finally breaks, Sally's family will get the answers they've been waiting for. Her body will be found. She'll be laid to rest properly. Her name will shift from missing to found. And the person responsible will face justice. Not today. Maybe not soon. But someday. Sally and John didn't disappear. Someone made her disappear. And one day soon, we hope, the silence will finally break. Until then, she waits. And we remember. If you have any information about the disappearance of Sally and John, please contact Wiltshire Police or Crime Stoppers anonymously. Every piece of information matters. Every voice counts. Sally's family is still waiting for answers. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for helping keep Sally's memory alive. Rest in peace, Sally and John. You are not forgotten.